What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Shattering Superstructure. On this episode, we have the great Boots Riley speaking about his new TV series, I'm a Virgo, his movie, Sorry to Bother You, some of his musical work, and a little bit about leftist politics and the current genocide against Palestinians in Gaza happening right now. It's a wide ranging conversation, and I have a very special co host with me on this episode, my brother Aaron. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening. First of all, I'm a Virgo was a fantastic series.
Oh,
I absolutely loved it.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And Oakland is a huge character, in both Sorry to Bother You and I'm a Virgo.
Yeah.
Um, Particularly with I'm a Virgo. So what was the impetus of this series, and was there ever a part of you that didn't want to set it in Oakland?
Oh no, never a part of me that didn't want to set it in Oakland. I mean, um, you write what you know. So um not just because that's all you can do, because you can write other things you don't know. And it's certainly valid to do that. But to me, um, the specificity, the details of anything is what makes it feel more human, right?
Right.
So much of TV is set in a place that could be anywhere. And, and we had those problems with this. We had to fight for as much Oakland as we could get. But I think so much is like, supposed to be, XYZ place, but it's filmed in Vancouver or, whatever. And what you end up doing is having a lot of stuff that where the shots are picked based on it not looking like the city that it's in. So you have a lot of the film where the shots are chosen in the same way that someone might choose someone to marry based on the fact that they are not abusive. And that's their criteria, So it's not really why you want to choose to marry someone. It's also not why you want to choose your shots. You want things based on what you feel tells the story the best, what conveys the best emotion, whatever it is that you want, and that specificity is what makes things so. And with Sorry to Bother You, a lot of it looked and felt so different, mainly because we shot it in a place that I knew, and I had ideas about, okay, we're going to do this at this gas station with the train going by, or you know what, this show is not about people being homeless, but we're going to drive by this homeless encampment. Things that you wouldn't normally put in things because, and it does tell part of the story, the specifics of it.
Yeah, yeah, no question. I mean, um, you know, and pivoting to like the characters and their roles in society in this, and I think both of your works, but specifically in I'm a Virgo, there's a sense that people with superpowers are sort of confined to being workers without a ladder to climb. And we don't really see any in positions of power except the hero, who's not really a hero, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's like they're so undervalued, and they control very little of the means of production. So what was intriguing to me is to seeing how these characters can unite and sort of spark a revolution. And you have sort of two different conversations. Um, it starts between Jones and La Francine, and it kind of evolves into two parties. and sort of how to go about this. So what went into those two sort of approaches? In terms of Jones is all about, starting this groundswell movement. And I think LaFrancine has, well, we need to have a face for this movement. And
Yeah.
it's going to take
And that is maybe putting forward their ideas that have something to do with Cootie. But it also represents in the real world kind of what got very popular with the New Left from the times of the New Left and on, in which things were more about spectacle than they had been on the, for radicals before that. In the United States, from in the 20s and 30s, there were 1 million card-carrying communists in the United States. And strikes going on all over the place. It was just after a revolution in the Soviet Union, and there were and there was militancy even in things that weren't so radical, like the bonus march, right? You had this march going to Washington with people carrying guns and around bonus checks that were supposed to be gotten for veterans. And with that combination of things happening, with tens of thousands of people marching in the street that weren't just demonstrations, but were from specific industries saying, here are tens of thousands of people that will shut you down if you don't do this and if you don't do that. There was a different kind of movement happening that was thought of as possibly being able to turn into a real revolutionary movement. And it was in that milieu that that we got stuff like welfare and Social Security and Medicare, things like that. It wasn't because there was some leader at the top, but during the United Front Against Fascism, and part of it was that revolutionaries here were not going to try to make a revolution while the US went and helped the Soviets defeat Hitler. And so a lot of people went underground. Mm-hmm. And that made way for, after the war in the 50s, for there to be able to be finger pointing at folks saying, hey, these folks are radicals, they're communists, they're revolutionaries, and they haven't been telling you, because while they went underground, people started calling themselves progressives or whatever, right? And so, whereas then it was true, they hadn't been telling people for 15 years who they were. Had it been 15 years before, people would have been like, yeah, I know, they told me that our strike was part of this revolutionary movement, or they helped me, not be evicted. I knew about all that. That would have been the thing. But because of that, and because of splits that happened in the biggest radical organization that there was in the US, due to revelations around the cult of personality that happened with Stalin, things like that, that organization split up. And from those splits came groups that became what we called the New Left. And many of the folks that joined the New Left, and the folks that came out of the old movement, said, well, we're going to do this different. We're not going to be underground. We are about to be in your face. And people were like, we are revolutionaries. But the differences one of the big differences was they started focusing on students and started focusing on cities, and they left behind, and I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but in general, they subtracted themselves from on-the-job organizing and labor struggles. Part of that was they were being pushed out of it, but radicals never just let the fact that they were being pushed out of something, end up with them being pushed out. There was a tactical decision to move into other areas. And in the time that I talked about before with the 20s and 30s, the FBI had called places like Montana, Utah, Oklahoma, Alabama, had called all those places hotbeds of communist activity, right? So then in the 60s, all those places were being moved away from, geographically and politically being moved away from. And so if you're focusing on students, and focusing on problems from a place where you are just exposing certain problems of oppression, then what ends up happening is more spectacle, right? So instead of a 20,000 person march where everybody's from an industry where they say we can shut you down, and that was actually a demonstration in the sense that it was a demonstration of power, then you might end up having a 5,000 people demonstration at a college in which people are saying, we hate this, we don't like this, and no connection to what power the working class has. And at the same time, you had revolutions happening all over the world, and some of them more radical than others, but you had everything from independence movements to actual revolutionary communist or socialist movements happening. And the New Left here was, as they should have been, excited by that. And so, and many times the New Left tried to aesthetically simulate what was going on in those other countries, while having skipped over the phases that those other countries went through to get that.
Like the Maoist movements in the colleges in the 60s and stuff.
Yeah. And so there was a lot of focus on, things, adventurous things like Che's stuff, which did not create any revolutions at all. And also, focusing on him as opposed to what happened in Cuba, just months before the revolution, which were all of these strikes that made that possible, right?
Right.
And so there was a lot of focus on that, and I think that what came about from the 60s and 70s in the New Left hugely affected the way people worked, even through me coming up and even until recently. And I think there's a big change now in that. And we have the strike wave happening. And so I think what we see in that conflict, what's represented in that conflict between LaFrancine and Jones is Jones wanting to build a viable revolutionary movement, and one that starts with the ability to showing people what class struggle is, and through the ability to withhold labor, and wanting to do that, and so I think that what ends up happening is and LaFrancine representing some of that New Left position,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like Jones does, she's got the Fruitvale rent strike. Um, she's got the eviction campaign, and her housing speech at the hospital is incredibly powerful too. And there's also more subtle things like, Elijah Wood's character. Like, how is he going to change the death penalty? Well, he's going to become an executioner.
Mhm.
And kind of conversations about how they're going to basically incent change. um, what I thought was most interesting about her speech is she kind of uses her power to get a hold of Cootie, who up until that point I would consider the lumpen proletariat, and he's finally converted into a maybe a proletariat only because he's been sheltered for all his life, right? He doesn't
Mhm.
really, he's just starting to realize it, and it hits him like a brick wall. So I think there are some examples of this on very rarely on film and TV, but you know, how do we in real life convert the lumpen proletariats to the cause?
Well, I think in real life, here's the thing: is you move based on where you can, and so I think um, when there is a large movement, people look for how to get involved. Often, people don't get involved in things because they don't see it being able to help. They don't see it being able to they don't yeah they think that it's as powerless as they are. And what people are attracted to, even in capitalist culture, is the idea that it's not just, oh, they hope they can attain wealth, but people want a sense of being able to control their surroundings. um that's what people look up to. They look up to, oh, this dope dealer, they could do this and they did that and they made this happen. And or they might even put that into whoever the famous capitalist is of the time, right? And but there's a sense of being able to have some say in the world, and I always say that with, like with older with songs of like Jay-Z or whoever is new, because I honestly don't listen to a lot of the lyrics of the new stuff, but what they're talking about is not just, what to the listener is not just wealth. What they're hearing is someone that doesn't have to deal with their lights getting turned off, that doesn't have to deal, that has the power to supersede the problems of the system. And so people get attracted to that idea, right?
Right.
And when a movement gets big enough, it starts making gains, then people see that and they see it as powerful, as something they should be involved in. And so I think you start with the folks that are, you start organizing at the places where there's power. So that's why I talk about organizing on the job. I mean, because I look at it like this, living in Oakland, for instance, people's favorite subject to talk about is the Black Panther Party. And I know a lot of those folks, and I did work with David Hilliard, who was former chief of staff of the Black Panther Party, Elaine Brown, former chairperson of the Black Panther Party, all sorts of the alumni committee, all of those folks. But I have a principled criticism, many principled criticisms, as you should, of probably any group that does anything. You're right. But one big one is, think about it like this: at the time when the Panthers were going strong in Oakland, there were factories in Oakland. People had factory jobs, right?
Yeah.
They did not talk about organizing around any of that. Matter of fact, David Hilliard came out of longshoremen, right?
Right.
And so what they were attaching on to was this sort of new style, and we're going to organize the lumping. But most Black folks weren't even lumping.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that doesn't mean people weren't unemployed, but they were also thinking of themselves as just temporarily unemployed, thinking of themselves as, so there was a boat that was missed with that. And so right now, the thing that inspires the lumpen proletariat is this idea of something that's stable about capitalism, something that's powerful about it. And so they'll come along once we organize the working class more.
I see. Yeah, my brother and I have conversations about this all the time. He's in PSL North Bay, and it's just like, well, first of all, what happens leading up to the revolution? What happens next? I mean, in theory, obviously you have Marx's stages, but it's just, I often think too of the Frederick Jameson quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the destruction of late stage capitalism. So it's, I think, but the more we have conversations about it, the more we can be on a united front, right? Because that's the only way to do it. Yeah.
One thing I think about a lot is like we're seeing this wave of strikes and labor struggles that are making real gains, and talking about the kind of retreat to the universities, and we have the kind of retreat inward with the new left, especially getting into the 80s and 90s. And a lot of the workers of today, they don't have that language. Like there wasn't that sort of very clear kind of orthodox Marxist like analysis that people maybe gave in the 20s and 30s of, why you utilize your ability to withhold your labor in order to get gains. But people are coming to those realizations on their own. And I know within the various, unions, there's plenty of people that can illustrate that. But I've always felt like there is a kind of a missing generation between the kind of older, maybe old school leftists, and then the new movements. And is that an issue, or are these sort of power dynamics so obvious that people come to the realization on their own? Does that make sense?
Well, I think things don't get organized without people organizing them. So it won't, you need people to do that. And I would say that in the 20s and 30s, there were people that were outwardly saying, they were led by those things often were led by folks who were openly radical and talking about these things. Their skills were maybe sometimes in talking about the same ideas in a different way than, say, an academic would, right? Because they're changing it based on who they're using the language of the folks that they're communicating with. And yeah, I think that there definitely is I think what's happening right now is that there are a lot of radicals that are getting involved in labor struggles, and that didn't exist as much as it did, that didn't exist in the last 30 years as much. And although that definitely did exist, it's around. And what I said about the 60s is leaving out some amazing exceptions, right?
Of course.
And but so yeah, there is a gap. But what I found is that even those folks, you know, the older New Left folks, are willing to come around. It was kind of like, I think there was an idea with the folks that stayed around from the New Left, that stayed radical, that the working class wasn't ready. So this was the reason that they kind of retreated. But you know, one of the reasons I got involved in music was because while I was, you know, organizing beforehand, I would see people getting into rhetorical arguments with folks that they thought disagreed with them. And I thought that I could have, you know, that I could bridge that gap right there. But yeah, I think that it's interesting because I remember a couple years ago when the first big bump of the strike wave was happening, and I was talking to this guy who's a well-known radical longshore guy, and I don't remember what it was, but he was talking to me about something fairly small that he was trying to get. He's retired. I was like telling him about the strike wave, and he almost didn't believe me. Well, not almost, he didn't, right? He's like, I haven't heard anything about this. This is blah, blah, blah. And of course, he soon looked it up and saw it. But there is an isolation that happens, and sometimes that might just be age, you know, and sometimes it's, you know, within political circles. And I think what's happening now is people are becoming inspired by each other's work. So,
yeah,
it takes like just one big victory to open the floodgates. Sometimes that's what I feel like. I think we're slowly seeing that.
and like I love the soundtrack too. You got Mac Dre, Keep the Sneak, and E40, which is essential, I think, to adding to the sort of milieu you're talking about.
Yeah.
So was that always your intention to have Bay Area native artists on the soundtrack?
yeah, I mean, that's based on, yeah, definitely. Not that people in the Bay Area only listen to Bay Area artists, but you look for things that make you feel the texture, the specificity of things. So yeah, that was definitely a big thing. And sound and music is the way I make people think they're enjoying what they see, right? And you know, that's that, like the big part of it. So much of our brain is dedicated to figuring out what sounds are, much more than the part of our brain that's dedicated to figuring out what we see. So it doesn't necessarily, I don't know if that then makes a correlation with how important it is to us in our brain, but it is very important to us. I mean, it may just be that there's just more to figure out, right? But yeah, so sound, the score being tune yards, and then the sound effects and the soundtrack is all something there. We had the score to the show. I mean, before we had sold the show, so we had a lot of the score stuff. So.
Yeah, and speaking of sound, the cartoon, it's great throughout the series. I especially love the Zizek cameo, the voice cameo as a baby. I think I took it kind of as an allegory for how we propagandize pain and depict it as necessary for success, and um, also how capitalism can affect the most vulnerable. Um, but also, I think that um, you say so in the film, and this kind of aligns with Zizek's Pervert's Guide. It's all art is propaganda, right? The hero even says it himself. Um, so, A, do you believe under our, this probably an obvious question, under our, ideology, that all art is sort of political and propaganda? And Jones's, call it her superpower. She basically
Yeah.
persuades people with art. And I think it's no coincidence that you chose Zizek to do the voiceover for that, right?
Yeah.
So, what
Yeah.
went into that sort of thought process? And in your opinion, what does the cartoon sort of represent in our society?
I mean, well, a lot of my things, I start out with just one thing and it grows into a whole bunch of stuff. So I really um started thinking about what makes what makes me what are things about the real world that we don't get on TV. And when you can figure out some of those things, sometimes those are pieces that bring you in. And so um often growing up, um you know uh, uh, my father would say to me, like, you're sitting here spending hours watching TV because you think that's exciting. And if you notice something about the people you think life is exciting, they're not watching TV. And 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 so the truth is, though, that we all spend so many hours of our life watching TV or shows on some sort of screen or something like that. And so I was like, well, what makes their world is also what the media they're consuming. So I was like, okay, I need something that they are consuming. And so I decided that we should have a show in which the writers of that show um, really wanted to write something that they thought was really important, but were forced to do that in a certain way so that there was a catchphrase that people thought it was funny, and that what they were writing was about, and they were depressed and they thought they were the shit, right? So they're pretty pretentious writers as well. So that was where we started with it. And then because also what they are doing, they don't have any answers about it all. It's just there. And the the part about it that's being funny, which is the boy yo 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 yo,
Mm-hmm.
talking about uh, the dread of existence and the fear of not existing anymore, and having it consume cares about the way the world is going. And those are things that are real, that we all deal with, right? That um and I think I talk about that, like, so in Sorry to Bother You, those sorts of things, and how do you connect How do you make yourself feel more alive? And to me, that's through connecting with the world. And the best way to connect with the world is to change it. And um and so these are things talking about real fears, but as if it's just there, and that it is the most important thing to worry about. And so that's what those writers are putting forward. And yeah, so I don't know if that answered the
No,
question.
that's awesome. Um, and you know, it's speaking of like sort of getting through to the masses. I think social media is um it's inevitable that that's going to, you know, reach a lot of people and change a lot of minds. And I think, you know, especially what's happening right now in the current genocide in Gaza, there's so much misinformation out there. So it's like, how do
Yeah.
you sort through it, and how do you try to counteract, you know, the sort of more fascist right wing leaning Zionist talking points, right?
hmm Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because I don't know. I think that one, okay, I'm always trying to show people how they can change things,
Mm.
right? I don't, I'm not even on social media. I'm not normally just posting about things that are like, here's something terrible that's happening in the world,
Mhm.
right? That's usually not what I'm doing. I think maybe that's different now that I am doing that, because the way to change it is not necessarily clear. Um, the idea that, you know, the idea, which is something that was put out in the 60s, that we did lie to people about, which is, you raise your voice loud enough,
Mm.
you show your anger, and those in power will hear you and be scared.
Create awareness, right? It's that
Yeah.
awareness thing that has been so big in the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years, that
Yeah.
is
And
awareness.
what that relies on is this falsehood that we live in some sort of democratic society. Um, and it's the falsehood that is free speech, as if the speech actually does um, can change the way things are. And so what I was excited about the growing labor movement is that there are ways to change things. We saw some radical ideas being born in all of that. We saw that when people thought what was needed was ventilators. We saw the workers at Boeing shutting down, and one of their demands was that they want to make ventilators instead of jet engines, right?
Mm.
Um, we see strikes from school districts like Chicago, LA, and Oakland, where people are striking, um, and you know, beyond their demands for better pay, you're also seeing things that help out homeless people, that make it so that the community can have a say in the budget, things like that. And then you see things like with you know, the writer strike, and you know,
Mm.
things like that, where in which um, you know, a group of the folks that were striking for things that weren't affecting them, but were affecting folks on the lower rungs. And you saw that with the threat of the strike with the UPS, where people were, where the full-time workers were ready to go on strike for the part-time workers. And so we're seeing that growing. So we're seeing things in which there could be situations in which policy changes could come through shutting down industry. And with protesting a war, yeah, it's a little frustrating because what are you good, like we saw with the protests against the Iraq war, millions upon millions of people in the street. And there was some sense through the 90s when we would do demonstrations that, even knowing what I knew, like, oh, maybe if there were millions of folks in the streets, then we could get on. And you see, like, there's certain groups where their whole thing is protest, RCP or whatever. It'll be like, if you could get people out there and show your anger or whatever, right? But yeah, that's not how capitalism works. So there could be things in which you had the workers shut down ports, which is starting to happen in Barcelona and Belgium. You could
It
have
happened here in Oakland a couple of years ago. They sent Israeli, I think, tanker back. They didn't let them in. And, yeah, that was pretty
definitely.
amazing.
So those can, and it's starting to happen with shutdowns from the outside, but shutdowns from the outside, I don't think we're not going to be able to do that because people can't stay there for that long, and you're not going to be able to spread it out in the way that you need to do. So there's a certain amount of radical organizing that has to be done in order to do that. Maybe the disgust with the genocidal acts that are happening might be something that motivates people to join these strikes and do something. But I think that's the only hope. I do think there's something necessary with something like this, for instance, which is I think this war could be used to try to move people to the right, and I think it's important and for instance, in the milieu that I happen to be involved in now, which is Hollywood, there are a lot of folks there that are against the atrocities that are happening in and to Gaza, who feel like they might not have a job if they speak out, right? So that they can't. And the ones that are comfortable speaking out are sometimes the ones who are agreeing with the Zionist movement. So there becomes a perception that, especially since a lot of those folks have big platforms, there becomes this perception among average everyday people that the bombings and invasions and killings in Gaza are somehow justified. And so I think it's important for folks to know that everybody hasn't drunk the Kool-Aid. But I think it's important to have demonstrations so that we let the community know that there are people against this. What I'm concerned with is figuring out how to turn it into something empowering, because it can easily become something that dissuades people from doing stuff.
Well, I feel like there is a fracture happening, and I'm hoping it can turn into something, because you still have the people in media and entertainment, a lot of them because of their like material incentives or personal beliefs, are sort of towing this Zionist line, but it just doesn't seem to be working as much on regular people. And
Yeah.
I do feel like there's going to be a reckoning for a lot of the people that, because we're watching this happen in front of our eyes, and people, I mean, Israel mows the lawn every few years, and it just is a blip in the news. But this just feels different, and I really feel like people are not falling for it.
Oh yeah, I think you're right
Yeah,
about that.
but where does that go? I mean, besides just kind of disgust with the people in power. I mean, the 2008 crash showed the volatility of the finance system and how corrupt it is, and yet people just know that but carry on normally. And so
Yeah,
I guess that's always the question, is
and
how do
I
we
think that has so much to do with what people think can be done.
yeah,
With us showing people um what the mechanism is, what the mechanism of power
Mhm.
is for them. And that is why, I think that because yeah, I think that if, you know, dock workers around the world, for instance, said we're not having any trade
Yeah,
or war materials sent back and forth from Israel and the US, it would have to be with the US as well.
yeah,
Um, then you'd start to see some pressure. Um, but I think a lot of people do kind of feel like, well, what is there to be
yeah,
done? What you know, and yeah, it's I think for instance had it we've got this militant um this labor movement getting uh getting growing, and it's starting off. But say something like this happened in 10 years from now, and we had that same rate of growth, then you could be like, hey, we're going to shut this down, we're going to shut that down, we're going to do this. But now I still think that's where the work has to be, because people do understand that if that were to happen, it could help. You know what I'm saying? It could stop it. The question, I think it's a huge question of whether, we have the organizers in place to get folks to do that, you know.
yeah,
Um, and but it's possible. Like you said, we had longshoremen um, pledge to do that before, and doing that before. And we have movements and we have unions in other countries doing that. And it's a chance even for some of the more established liberal unions to to show relevance, right?
yeah.
They could do it for those reasons, especially if they know that their rank and file uh, would respect them for it, right? So those are possibilities. I don't, there's there's congressmen writing campaigns, things like that. I'm not against any of them. I don't know. I don't have any much faith in that at all.
Yeah, and like, you know, what would like there was this post I saw a while back that was saying like, genocide is the new blood libel, tearing down hostage flyers is the new crystal knot. And I don't agree with obviously the tearing down the hostage flyers, but the Hamas charter is the new Mein Kampf. I just feel like these comparisons should be insulting to everyone, but there's so many people that are going like, "Oh yeah, you're so right. Thanks for speaking out." And it's like half these people don't even know that the U.S. is funding the IDF, and it's just like, so how do
Yeah.
you respond to something like that if it's even, you know,
I mean, you just
outrageous?
respond to it one by one. You say, well, look, you want, hey, we want the hostages returned too, and here is the way Hamas said they'll return the hostages: is trade them for prisoners. So if you want the hostages returned, that seems like the simple thing. Actually, it's what the families of the hostages are asking to be done, right?
Right.
So if someone is putting up return the hostage posters and not saying that in the poster, then what they're calling for is war and calling for something that won't return the hostages, right?
Right.
So there's just simple logic with all of it.
And you may not convince that one person, but the people around them and the people around you, they respond to these logics. And it's tough because that's been sort of the strategy of the left for the past 40, 50 years, is like just convince people. And it's so hard because, like I said earlier, like we've lost a lot of the language, and sometimes the language I use, it doesn't feel strong, it falls flat, you know, it might be outdated or something. But what I respect so much about your work is that you're showing, you're showing the mechanisms. You always show the beginning of the groundswell, and what comes after that is up to the people. But even through sort of like the kind of magical realism elements you put in, you're showing very like material possibilities of how you can change your environment. And I think you don't need, you know, Marxist language to show people that. You just need to point out how things work, and it
Yeah.
becomes self-evident after that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. The question is, how do people uh engage with the system that they're in? How do they engage normally, and how would they, what are the things that would get them to engage in a way that changes it? And you know, so that's just kind of where I take it from. And you know, it you know, all fantasy, all sci-fi, any of that, the people that write it, they have a view of the world, and they're writing about what they think is important in the world. They're writing about how they think the world works, you know, what it is about it. So you know, and so, but sometimes when we have an alternate view of how the world works, alternate from what has been fed to us, we unconsciously tailor that thing that we're writing or creating to fit with what we've seen in sci-fi or fantasy or any film, and you know, for that matter, in there. And so often I'm having to remind myself what I believe about the world, like as I'm right, like, okay, how does this fit in? How is this working? Is this, you know, that sort of a thing?
Is there an example you can give in some of your works?
Well, I mean, you know, like let's say, sorry to bother you for, well, I'll say this: with all of my songs, I had to do that as I'm going. Like, okay, I'll write out all sorts of like brainstorming things, because you could be writing a lyric and you have this awesome thing that will, oh my God, that'll make people will be like, you're the best lyricist ever. But then I have to be like, okay, does that actually fit with how does that contradict what I'm saying about the world right there?
Yeah.
And so I have to be like, okay, that, you know, That's not what I'm going to say. This is what I think is the main contradiction, and then that will create some other lyric that I like, right? And then so, or like with "Sorry to Bother You," when I was writing it, and I got to the part with Danny Glover, I knew I wanted to talk about how people try to sound white on the phone. And I was going to do it with that same monologue he gives, but it was just going to be like him, trying to just doing it with his own voice. And then we see, and but then I was like, okay, does that express everything I think about that idea? Like how do I put that in there without having 2 minutes more dialogue in there, right? And then even then, what I knew from things is about, you make people feel something, you make them go through something. That's what people are doing when the reason why organizing is important, for instance, the reason why having people organize on the job and do work stoppages is important is because those are things that people go through that show them how class works in, under capitalism. It doesn't just tell them. They see, oh, we're on strike and the police aren't coming to protect me, they're coming to protect the boss. That going through that experience is different than even watching it on a movie or reading about it. It's a different kind of thing. So with the movie, I'm trying to bring people as much as possible, bring them through a experience, make them feel something, use things that textures and sounds and emotion to make people feel like they're going through something. So that thing, how do I make them the feeling of what it feels like, how disembodied it feels? And I was like, okay, well, it's going to be overdubbed. And matter of fact, it's not just going to be overdubbed for the audience. We're going to understand that the people in the film experience it as an overdub. So, that those are things, and that those are things where I have to like think about whether the thing is really giving, putting everything that I think about the world in there, and how and so that has to do with how I think people experience ideas.
Incredible.
And have you had a relatively like smooth path to expressing your ideas, or have you encountered any instances of like censorship where you had to fight back against, whether in music or film, TV?
I mean, always. I mean, as you're creating something, you don't necessarily, as you're writing something or something like that. I have, luckily, I've been on labels that, even though they're just as capitalist as the next, their way of doing things was just like, oh, we want to do something that's organic and sell the organic thing to that crowd or whatever, right? And so it hasn't been from there, but with gatekeepers along the way, definitely. I mean, sometimes people telling me at the time, sometimes people telling me years later that this particular thing happened and they worked at this place. I mean, one of the first things that I found out about was, like, we have a song, Fat Cats and Bigger Fish, that this woman, Mona Lisa Murray, wanted to prove herself to Wild Pitch, and she kind of snuck it onto the air at, what is that, 105.9 in LA. I forget the name of that, Power 106 or something like that. And it got popular there, and then was getting on the radio all the time. And up here, it wasn't getting on KMEL because they were like, oh, we think it's just your fans calling up. So they wouldn't, and I'm like, okay, yeah, if somebody's calling, they're a fan, right? But at a certain point, it was selling enough per week in the two places it was being played on the radio, to go platinum, meaning like if they had spread it out to other stations. But it became clear that EMI just took it off their list and said, don't play this anymore. And it had nothing to do with, even though it was growing, all those sorts of things. So that was pretty crazy, but a lot of stuff all along the way, like little things like that, uh where things just didn't happen because I didn't play ball in certain ways. But it didn't stop me. It wasn't censorship that stopped me, because I could just go around and do something else. But it just wasn't, the path that got me, got it really well known. I think with film, what happens is, there's a lot of there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of people that feel like they are your friend, and that they'll tell you how this goes. So there would never be anything overt, that was ever said. One of the reasons is that everybody thinks that they are not part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how it all works. We're all part of the system, and we all think we're not. So a lot of people will agree with everything we're talking about, but they might be like, well, maybe this part is boring. I've definitely had that on both projects. This part is boring, and it's maybe one of the most exciting parts of the thing, but so it would never be that sort of thing.
Interesting. And do you have a project that you're working on next, film or TV wise, or a new album?
Yeah, hopefully if the strike is over, we'll be shooting something that is inspired by my song I Love Boosters, and we'll be doing that in March.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's
Very
great. Would that be in the film or TV medium?
Film.
Oh, that's great. It's going to take place in Oakland?
In the Bay Area.
Bay Area. Okay. It's awesome. Yeah, I can't wait for that. Yeah, Boots, can't thank you enough for your generous time. It's been really insightful and great hearing from you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.